America in World War II, 1941 to 1945. For these next few years, the United States is going to be engaged in one of the biggest wars in global history. Now, you've already seen in our last two lessons how the war progressed in Europe and how the United States eventually came to enter the war on the side of the Allies. Now, let us see how the war impacts America and America impacts the war. First up, life on the home front. How are things for the Americans living at home? Now look at this poster on the side. It says here, "When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler." Shows a well-dressed man in a fedora in an otherwise empty car with a penciled-in drawing of Der Fuhrer right next to it. It says, "Join a car-sharing club today." I'm going to explain a little bit more about what those are in a moment. So, rationing. The first issue is rationing. Food and fuel commodities were limited due to two things. One, military use. Things such as fats and greases were essential components in making ammunition like bullets and shell casings. Additionally, fuel oil was essential to almost every element of the United States military. The last coal battleships were used during the Spanish-American War. From World War I onward up until the nuclear age, battleships were run on gasoline, as were tanks, armored vehicles, jeeps, and other manner of military weapons, including aircraft, all ran on petroleum. As a result of this, the same oil that powered cars was also necessary for almost every machine in the war effort. Then there was war production. The U.S. was now trying to rebuild its army and its navy and air force. As you saw in the previous videos I made you watch, particularly the Why We Fight, Video 1, Prelude to the War, it mentioned that in keeping with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which the U.S. and other nations signed, which was supposed to end war, as a treaty ending war as a means for settling disputes among nations, in accordance with the arms reductions in that treaty, the United States sunk a large amount of its navy and disbanded a large amount of its army after the First World War, thus leaving the United States with a relatively small military force. The U.S. was going to need to build up its army in order to compete against Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. Now, in order to accommodate both the war production and then also, it must be remembered, food sources were needed for the soldiers. America was going to have an incredibly large army. As the old expression goes, armies march on their stomachs. That is to say, an army without food supplies cannot endure. This fact must be remembered. If your army lacks food, it will not survive. So as a result, flour, corn, sugar, butter, and other goods were rationed by the government. You would get a ration card. Now, you still have to pay for these goods, but you would only be allowed to buy a certain amount of these goods at any given time. Now, in order to keep competition fair, prices were also mandated at certain levels. Now, lower speed limits were also introduced, as well as car sharing to help conserve oil, which is what you saw with that poster earlier about a car sharing club. Now, another issue was war industries. So American consumer goods companies were compelled by law and public pressure to enter into war productions. So companies that had previously produced consumer goods and toys and things like that suddenly became war-producing companies. Now, unemployment screeches to a halt as a result of war production. So much industry was required to build up the United States military that suddenly large sectors of the public were employed. In fact, in order to accommodate war production out in the Midwest, they actually built new locomotives, massive vehicles with 16 driver wheels, so large they had to be segmented in the middle to be able to get around turns, were invented just to haul these massive payloads of military weapons. Now, unemployment ends because of this. Now, with many of the men leaving to join the war, women and minorities, people who usually had a lot of trouble finding jobs during the Depression, suddenly were in high demand. You see here the Rosie the Riveter. Yes, we can do it. Then below that you see this other image. It's an old political cartoon where it says, "Smoke gets in their eyes, all out U.S. production." So you can see here the image. The three men who are crowded in smoke are caricatures of the Emperor, the Führer, and Il Duce. So, propaganda. The other major weapon in the U.S. arsenal was propaganda. That is to say, government posters that were encouraging three things: support for the war effort, hatred of the enemy, and admiration for U.S. allies. So let's talk about the first one, support for the war effort. Many Americans were, as I mentioned previously, weary of war. And as a result of that, in order to convince people to get on board for an all-out war, you had to encourage them that they had to do everything possible. So you have inspiring images like the one up here of Uncle Sam, billowing American flag at his back, a whole squadron of bombers flying overhead, and a charging battalion of brave soldiers charging forward at his command. You also have this image, warning, our homes are in danger now. And an image of a conniving-looking Hitler holding a Luger, and a menacing-looking Japanese man clutching, which I'm assuming is meant to be the Emperor, although he's wearing a military uniform, and is holding a bloody knife, looming over an image of America. Now, it also is supposed to produce hatred of the enemy. If you look up here, you'll see a picture of a book, which is labeled as Holy Bible. You'll see a hand that has plunged a bayonet dagger through the center of it. On the sleeve of that arm is a German swastika, indicating that this is how Nazis are going to treat religion. Now, admiration for U.S. allies. You'll notice there are two posters on the side. One set, both have the same caption. This man is your friend. He fights for freedom. Both have an image of two different soldiers, and they are labeled. One is clearly a Soviet soldier, which you can tell from the hammer and sickle encased in a star upon his helmet. It says Russian. The other is a British soldier, which is really only identifiable by the fact that only the British soldiers still use this World War I style pit helmet that he's currently wearing. Now, this was important, especially in the case of the first picture I showed you, Soviets. Many Americans were terrified of communism. Many could not understand why it was that America would join forces with the communists. And as a result of this, you had to convince the American people that the Soviets were actually on their side and wanted freedom, not totalitarian oppression. So it was very important to try and sell this argument. It was very difficult to get the public on board with the idea of the Soviets as allies. So posters like this were important to try and convince the public that the U.S. was fighting alongside the right people. Now, let's go to internment camps. Now, things weren't all nice and rosy on the home front. Japanese Americans were suspected of disloyalty. Now, these were American citizens who were of Japanese ancestry. However, people began to believe that they were a fifth column, that is to say, a disloyal portion of the population that, in time of war, would end up aiding their ancestral homelands. In order to accommodate this paranoia, FDR issued Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 removed Japanese Americans from their homes and businesses and imprisoned them in government camps. Now, this case was challenged in the famous Korematsu versus United States. In this case, a young Japanese American man by the name of Korematsu sued, arguing that his 14th Amendment right to protection, equal protection of the law, was being violated. The only reason he was being suspected of disloyalty was because he was of Japanese descent. Well, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, in which the majority decision, as produced by Justice Hugo Black, ruled that as long as the motivation was not strictly racial prejudice, it was allowable for an entire class of citizens to be suspected of disloyalty and moved to government camps. It should be noted that while the government did apologize for these actions under President Ronald Reagan, this ruling has never been overturned. And the power to do something similar is something that the government technically does still have to this day, which is a rather unsettling thought the longer you think about it. Racial discrimination. So, segregation of African Americans in the military. African Americans were still not integrated with the entire fighting force. They would fight in their own segregated units. One of the most famous of these is the Tuskegee Airmen, who were an all-black fighter pilot squadron. Now, additionally, anti-German, anti-Italian, and anti-Japanese prejudices emerged. The anti-German sentiment was strong, but not as strong as it was in World War I. There weren't lynchings this time. Japanese sentiment was incredibly vicious, especially in California and other states that had a history of anti-Asian prejudice. The anti-Italian prejudice never really reached a terribly high fever pitch. The other issue is that blacks in particular were the target of enemy propaganda. A lot of images depicting American soldiers as uncivilized black men and things like that became commonplace, especially in Italian propaganda under the fascists. Now, one other thing that became very startling to a lot of African Americans was the degree to which racial prejudice even existed among their own ranks. There's a story that you can find in your textbook about a pair of African American soldiers, and they're in a town in the United States, at which point they enter into a restaurant to be informed that they are not allowed in there because the restaurant doesn't serve black folks. However, they refuse to move, not out of spite, but out of sheer shock. The shock in question being that seated at the lunch counter are a set of German prisoners of war eating lunch. In other words, the people of this small southern town would rather serve German POWs than American GIs. This is a rather interesting story. Now, America enters the fight. So, America's role in the war. So first, let's be clear. The key to U.S. victory was outproduction. The U.S. produced more weapons than the entire Axis. Now, what made this possible was the size and security of American manufacturing sector. So one, America had a very large manufacturing sector to begin, if due to nothing else than the simple size of the United States, encouraged the building of a large amount of factories and firms. And when all of these were mobilized towards the war effort, it gave the United States an unprecedented volume of war production capability. The other issue is the security of it. Now, Britain had a lot of factories and a lot of natural resources, but these were scattered about a large empire, and so they could be disrupted by German attacks at sea, or by fighting in the colonial homelands. U.S. resources, I mentioned in the later bullet point, secure supply on natural resources. Both our natural resources and our manufacturing were contained within the continental United States, well under U.S. government sovereignty and protection from enemy interference. The other issue is that unlike Germany and Britain, which pounded each other relentlessly with bombings, the German blitzkrieg, which was so effective against other countries and whose bombers were still effective against Britain, were powerless against the United States due to an incredibly embarrassing Nazi oversight. The Nazis were so interested in the blitzkrieg as their main military strategy that they focused all of their attention on lightweight bombers, dive bombers and other lighter bombers that, though very efficient at blitzkrieg warfare, didn't have the fuel tanks necessary to carry any impressive payload across the Atlantic and return. As a result of this, America was out of bombing range for the Third Reich, meaning American factories could pretty much rest easy that they weren't going to be bombed, which prevented the enemy from disrupting the U.S. War machine process in the way that the U.S. would be able to interrupt the warfare for other nations. The other issue is newer weapons. It must be remembered that Britain had started building weapons, but only in 1939. So by 1941, those weapons are already a little bit old. Germany and Japan had been gearing up for a while, and stay tuned for the finishing of that sentence.